Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive two-century saga of armies marching across Europe and the Middle East. For nearly 200 years, kings, knights, peasants, and merchants traveled thousands of miles from their homes. And sure, they fought in the name of faith, but they also fought for territory, for serious wealth, and for sheer political power. These campaigns, which we call the Crusades, totally rewired the history of both Europe and the Middle East, and they left a deeply complicated legacy that we are still trying to untangle today.
So let's just bust the biggest myth right out of the gate. You might be wondering, were the Crusades really just one giant holy war? Absolutely not. No way. These campaigns were never some single unified conflict. Actually, it's a lot messier than that. We're talking about an ongoing, deeply tangled series of wars involving Christians, Muslims, Jews, and tons of shifting political factions within all three of those religious worlds. Behind every battle were incredibly complex questions about empire, pilgrimage, and honestly, mere survival.
To really wrap our heads around how this all kicked off back in the 11th century, we have to talk about Jerusalem. And I don't mean just looking at a spot on a map. You have to understand that this city was an incredibly powerful, emotionally charged symbol for millions of people.
Look at it this way. Control over this city carried literal world-altering weight. For Christians, it was deeply tied to the life, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus. For Muslims, it was intimately connected to the Prophet Muhammad and the sacred history of Islam. And for Jews, well, the city had been the absolute beating heart of their religious life and heritage for thousands of years. Because multiple global faiths considered this specific place to be sacred, Jerusalem became one of the most contested spots on the planet. It was a prize powerful enough to literally move armies across continents.
But the actual spark that lit the fire, that happened further east. Picture this. It's the 11th century, and the Christian Byzantine Empire, based over in Constantinople, is sweating. They're under immense pressure. In 1071, they take a massive catastrophic hit at the Battle of Manzikert against the Seljuk Turks. This devastating loss basically cracks Anatolia wide open to Turkish expansion. Feeling incredibly vulnerable, the Byzantine emperor sends out a desperate plea for military backup to a very unexpected place, the papacy in Western Europe.
Enter Pope Urban II. We're going to see how the leader of the Western Church took this desperate plea from the East and totally flipped it to flex his own papal power and ignite a massive movement. So it's 1095 at the Council of Clermont, and the Pope basically says, hey, take up the cross, go recover the sacred territory. And man, religious enthusiasm spread like wildfire. But, and this is a big but, the people who actually packed up and went, the first Crusaders, had wildly different agendas. Sure, some were genuinely in it for the spiritual rewards or thought they were answering a divine command, but others, they just wanted an adventure far beyond their tiny villages. A lot of them were chasing land or wealth, and for the big players, it was pure, calculated political ambition.
This first crusade was a totally grueling slog over several years. It actually kicked off with the People's Crusade, basically thousands of everyday folks marching off before the actual armies were even ready. As you can guess, that ended in total disaster, with disease, hunger, and massive violence. Eventually, the actual armies of nobles and knights show up. They march thousands of miles, no modern roads, just intense heat, thirst, and constant ambushes by Muslim armies, until they finally push through, endure long sieges, and capture Jerusalem in 1099. But that 1099 victory? It came with an unimaginably dark reality. After weeks of brutal fighting to break through the defenses, the city fell, leading to one of the absolute darkest episodes of the era. A massive number of Muslims and Jews were killed. Historians still debate the exact figures, but contemporary accounts describe a widespread, horrifying slaughter. That violence left a permanent scar, transforming the whole conquest into this enduring symbol of foreign invasion and religious terror for many Muslims.
Now, setting up these new Christian-controlled Crusader states is one thing. Actually keeping them? Totally different story. They were thousands of miles from Europe and completely surrounded by powerful Muslim rulers, so just holding on required constant, exhausting expeditions, plunging the whole region right into a new era of conflict.
By the 12th century, the tide really starts to turn. The Second Crusade is a total flop at recapturing lost territory. But more importantly, the Muslim world starts uniting. This is largely thanks to a brilliant ruler of Kurdish origin named Saladin. Rising to power in Egypt and Syria, this guy completely flips the script. In 1187, he delivers a crushing blow to the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin, destroying their army. And then, later that same year, Saladin's forces shock all of Europe by recapturing Jerusalem.
That massive loss triggers the Third Crusade, bringing some of Europe's heaviest hitters to the east. And it sets the stage for one of history's most legendary rivalries, England's Richard the Lionheart facing down Saladin. Now, Richard was a beast on the battlefield. He captured the crucial city of Acre and even bested Saladin in a few major clashes. But despite all that military muscle, he just could not reconquer Jerusalem.
Later stories love to romanticize these two as heroic equals, but the historical reality was way more pragmatic. They were bitter enemies, sure, but they both fundamentally understood the limits of their own military power. Neither could completely wipe the other out. So instead of total victory for anyone, it ended in a stalemate and a pragmatic negotiation. Jerusalem stayed firmly under Muslim control, but they struck an agreement allowing Christian pilgrims peaceful access to the sacred city. Fast forward a bit, and things start getting seriously warped. Over the next few decades, that initial, laser-like focus on Jerusalem just sort of fades. The entire crusading enterprise gets hijacked by European politics, sketchy shifting alliances, and, believe it or not, crippling financial debt.
The Fourth Crusade is a perfect example of just how far off the rails things had gotten. In 1202, Crusaders needed ships to get to the Holy Land, but they couldn't afford the bill from Venice. To settle up, the Venetians literally redirect this holy army to attack the Christian city of Zara, and it snowballs from there. By 1204, these Crusaders ended up attacking, capturing, and brutally looting Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the Eastern Mediterranean. They permanently shattered relations between Eastern and Western Christianity, and get this, they never even made it to Jerusalem.
Because of fiascos like the Fourth Crusade, the very definition of the word changed. It wasn't just about fighting Muslims in the Holy Land anymore. European rulers started weaponizing the term for their own gain. They'd slap the Crusade label on military campaigns driven purely by political ambition, attacking Christian rivals back home in Europe, or directing massive armies against groups they just labeled as heretics.
Meanwhile, back in the Middle East, European support was drying up fast. The European presence in the Holy Land effectively comes to an end when Muslim forces capture the final major Crusader stronghold of Acre in 1291. The banners come down, the armies pack up and go home, but the reverberations of this whole era, they were really just getting started.
When you actually tally up the final outcomes, you have to look at the whole picture. On one side, Mediterranean trade just explodes, making Italian cities like Venice and Genoa incredibly wealthy. European merchants get flooded with new goods, ideas, and technologies, basically supercharging the connections between civilizations. But you have to balance that against the sheer, devastating trauma. We're talking widespread massacres of entire cities, enslaved prisoners, and horrific persecutions of European Jewish communities, often attacked in their own towns before the armies even left Europe.
And the memory of that violence has survived way longer than the castles have. Even centuries later, historical memory becomes this potent political weapon. European empires invoked Crusade imagery to justify marching right back into the Middle East. And even today, modern political movements on all sides throw around the word crusade as a symbol of Western meddling or to define an ultimate historic enemy.
So, at the end of the day, these were never just neat little fairy tales about pious knights on heroic quests. They were messy, complicated, multi-generational sagas. It was this volatile cocktail of faith, economics, warfare, and raw human ambition. They showed us exactly what happens when religion is used as a tool to influence politics, and when political power uses religion to justify its actions and define its enemies.
Which brings us to a pretty heavy question to end on. If events from over 800 years ago are still actively being used to shape modern identities, how is the loaded language of the Crusades subtly steering the geopolitical conflicts we're watching unfold right now? I'll leave you with that to think about. Because, as this entire legacy of power, fear, and ambition shows us, history is almost never actually just in the past. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.